Why does the hardest choice always look like the simplest one? Grace Donnelly stood behind the counter that Wednesday morning, her hands steady, her voice calm, and said the words that would cost her everything. I won't ask a veteran to leave. And I won't ask his service dog to leave either. 6 years of loyalty. 6 years of opening early and staying late. 6 years of remembering names and birthdays and deployment dates. All of it gone in a single sentence. Her boss didn't yell. He didn't even look angry, just cold. Final, you're done here, Grace. She untied her apron, hands shaking just slightly, and walked toward the door. The cafe went silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence she'd built here, the kind where veterans could breathe and remember they were still human. This was different, heavy. Like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for someone to say it was all a mistake. But no one did. The state health inspector stood there with his clipboard, satisfied. The regional manager crossed her arms, unmoved. And Ray McMillan sat frozen in the corner booth, his service dog shadow pressed against his leg, both of them too stunned to move. Grace didn't cry. She walked out into the Georgia sunlight, the bell above the door jingling one last time, and stood on the sidewalk trying to remember how to breathe. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that someone had filmed the whole thing. A customer in the back corner, phone angled low, recording every word. And before the morning rush was even over, that video was already spreading. Fast, silent, unstoppable. Grace Donnelly wasn't the type of woman people noticed first, but she was the one they remembered longest. At 35, she ran the Mason Mug Café on the edge of downtown Mason, Georgia, 15 minutes from Fort Benning, one of the largest marine installations in the Southeast. The town itself looked like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Oak-lined sidewalks, American flags on every third porch, a hardware store that hadn't changed its paint color since the Reagan administration. But inside the cafe, things felt different, warmer, more human. Grace made sure of that. She didn't run the cafe like a business. She ran it like a second home, the kind of place where someone could walk in after a long day or a long deployment and feel human again. The coffee wasn't anything fancy. No espresso martinis or complicated froth art. Just strong, hot, reliable, with refills that never stopped coming. Handwritten notes covered the bulletin board behind the counter, reminders and thank yous and photos of faces that had passed through these doors. But what set the Mason Mug apart wasn't the coffee. It was Grace. She remembered names. She remembered birthdays. She remembered blackout dates for deployment. She knew who liked their eggs over hard and who hadn't touched coffee since they got back from Iraq. She made space for silence, especially the kind that came from veterans who carried more than just physical scars. And every Wednesday at 9 in the morning, she hosted what had quietly become a town tradition, Heroes Hour. It started with just 3 of them. Her father-in-law, Ben Donnelly, a retired Marine Corps drill instructor; Ralph, a Vietnam vet who rarely spoke but never missed a week; and Louisa, a former Army nurse with a laugh that echoed like wind chimes. Over time, the circle grew. Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Veterans from every era found their way to her cafe, drawn less by the menu and more by the woman who ran it. Grace would always say the same thing before starting. This is a place to be seen, not fixed. To sit, not perform. And they'd nod, shoulders easing as they sipped coffee and swapped stories, some funny, some heavy, and some too painful to tell with words. She never spoke much about her own story, but everyone in town knew the outline. Her husband, Staff Sergeant Michael Donnelly, was killed in action 6 years earlier in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. His photograph hung on the wall above the register, not in uniform but in jeans and a flannel, holding a mug of coffee outside the cafe's front door. It was taken 2 weeks before his final deployment. He never came home. Grace never remarried, never even hinted at it. She'd poured her grief into the cafe, not to escape it, but to build something out of it. Something that mattered. People loved her for it. But more than that, they respected her. Veterans called her ma'am without irony. Teens held the door for her without being told. Even the mayor stopped by once a month just to thank her for holding the town together better than most institutions. But for Grace, it was never about recognition. It was about the mission. The quiet one. The one that didn't come with medals but mattered just as much. Every time she poured a cup of coffee for a vet too anxious to sit in a crowded room. Every time she walked out from behind the counter to check if someone was okay after staring too long out the window. Every time she let a dog curl up under a table without asking questions. It wasn't a rule book she followed. It was instinct. It was love. And that Wednesday morning, the one where everything changed, started like all the others. The bell over the door jingled softly. The regulars filed in. Coffee brewed. The cafe filled with quiet chatter, laughter, and the warm hum of belonging. Grace didn't know it yet, but by the end of the day, that little corner cafe would become the center of a storm that would echo all the way to Washington. And it would all begin with a man, a dog, and a woman who refused to back down. What happens when kindness becomes defiance? It was a crisp Wednesday morning, the kind where sunlight looked cooler than it felt, and steam rose gently from every cup like little ghosts. Grace was behind the counter, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back, greeting every familiar face with that same nod, quiet but warm. She had already brewed the first pot of dark roast for Hero's Hour and was setting out the stack of ceramic mugs she saved just for the veterans. Then the door opened again and Ray McMillan stepped in with Shadow by his side. Ray was one of the newer faces. Late 50s, ex-Marine Corps recon. He didn't talk much and he never stayed long, but he came. That meant something. Shadow, his black lab German Shepherd mix, was never more than a few inches from his heel. The dog wore a bright red vest with bold white lettering. Service dog. Do not pet. Grace gave Ray a little wave. Table by the windows open, she said, smiling. Nodded, murmured a thanks, and guided Shadow to the far corner. Then the air shifted. The front door swung open with a brisk whoosh, and in walked a man in a navy blazer, neatly pressed slacks, and an expression that seemed allergic to joy. He carried a clipboard like it was a badge of honor. His name tag read Logan Prescott, State Health Inspector. Grace hadn't been expecting a visit. She greeted him politely. "Can I help you find something?" she asked. "An inspection," he said flatly, unannounced. He moved through the space with surgical detachment, tapping on metal surfaces, checking labels, pulling open refrigerator doors. And then he saw the dog. He stopped mid-step like he'd walked into a wall. "That animal," he said loudly, pointing toward Shadow, "is in violation of state health code. No animals permitted where food is served." Heads turned. Conversations went quiet. Grace stepped out from behind the counter, careful not to raise her voice. "He's a registered service dog," she said calmly. "Ada law permits his presence here." Prescott frowned, scanning the room like he was looking for backup. "I don't care what vest he's wearing," he snapped. "Animals carry dander, saliva, hair. This is a food hazard. Unless you want this cafe shut down, that dog goes." Ray stiffened in his chair, his hand gripping the coffee cup like it might fall. Shadow didn't move. He simply looked up at Ray and waited. The room fell into silence. Grace took a slow breath and said the words she knew she couldn't take back. "I won't ask a veteran to leave. And I won't ask his service dog to leave either. You're welcome to write your report, but you'll do it knowing you tried to humiliate a man who served this country in front of the very people he served to protect." Prescott's jaw clenched. From across the cafe, someone muttered, "Damn right." But it didn't matter because standing in the doorway now was another figure. Deborah Lyall, regional manager for the Mason Muggs parent company. Apparently she'd arrived early for a routine check-in, just in time to see it all. Her eyes were wide. Her tone was ice. "Grace Donnelly," she said, "you've just violated a direct health compliance policy in front of a state inspector. Pack your things, you're terminated." The words hit like a punch. Grace's breath caught. Ray stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. "You can't do this," he said, voice shaking. "She's protected us for years." Deborah didn't even look at him. "This isn't personal, it's policy." Grace felt the room spin. She wanted to scream, she wanted to argue, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. So instead, she untied her apron, folded it slowly, and placed it on the counter. She looked at Ray, at Shadow, at the faces of veterans who had become family. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Then she walked out, and the door closed behind her with the softest click. How long does it take for the truth to travel? Grace sat in her car outside the cafe for 20 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing. She wasn't crying, not yet. She was just numb, hollow, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that mattered. She'd given 6 years of her life to that place. 6 years of early mornings and late nights. 6 years of listening to stories she'd never repeat and holding grief she'd never fully understand. And now it was just over. She drove home in silence, parked in the driveway, and sat there until the sun moved behind the trees. Inside the house, everything looked the same. Michael's photo on the mantel, the Afghan his mother made draped over the couch, the coffee mug she'd used that morning still sitting in the sink. But something had shifted. The world felt smaller, quieter, lonelier. She didn't know what to do with herself. So she did what she always did when things got heavy. She walked through the neighborhood, past the hardware store, past the high school where Michael used to coach Little League, and eventually she found herself standing outside the gates of Fort Benning. She didn't go in. She just stood there, hands in her pockets, watching the flag move in the wind, wondering if Michael would have been proud of what she'd done, or if he'd think she was a fool. But while Grace was walking, something else was happening. That video, the one filmed by the customer in the back corner, had gone viral. Not just locally, nationally. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times. News outlets picked it up, military blogs, veteran advocacy groups. People were angry, furious. How dare they fire her for protecting a veteran? How dare they humiliate a man who served? The comments poured in. Support for Grace, outrage at the company, calls for boycotts and protests. And somewhere in the chaos, someone tagged a name. Colonel Marcus Gaines, U.S. Marine Corps, stationed at Fort Benning. He'd been in a meeting when his phone started buzzing. Once, twice, 20 times. He finally checked it and saw the video. Saw Grace standing her ground. Saw Ray's face, stunned and broken. Saw the inspector's smugness and the manager's cold dismissal. And something inside him snapped. Colonel Gaines was a man who didn't do things halfway. If he was going to act, he was going to act loud. He made 3 phone calls. The first was to his executive officer. Get me 4 Humvees and a full dress detail. We're going downtown. The second was to the base public affairs office. I need a statement ready in 30 minutes. We're making this official. The third was to Grace. He got her number from a mutual friend, a veteran who'd been at the cafe that morning. Miss Donnelly, he said when she answered. My name is Colonel Marcus Gaines. I need you to trust me, and I need you to go back to that cafe. By the time Grace arrived back at the Mason Mug, a crowd had already gathered. News vans, cameras, people holding signs, veterans in uniform. And in the middle of it all, 4 military Humvees parked in a perfect line. Colonel Gaines stepped out in full dress blues, medals gleaming in the sunlight. He walked straight to the front door, flanked by a full Marine detail. Inside, Deborah Lyall looked like she'd seen a ghost. The inspector had already left, but she was still there, trying to manage the fallout. Colonel Gaines didn't waste time with pleasantries. Ma'am, he said, his voice calm but firm. I'm here on behalf of the United States Marine Corps and every veteran who has ever walked through these doors. What happened here today was not just wrong. It was a disgrace. Grace stood outside, watching through the window, unable to believe what she was seeing. Deborah stammered something about company policy, about health codes, about liability. Colonel Gaines cut her off. This woman, he said, pointing toward Grace, has done more for the men and women of this installation than most programs with million-dollar budgets. She didn't do it for recognition. She didn't do it for money. She did it because it was right. And you fired her for it. He turned to face the cameras. Today, the Marine Corps is launching a formal wellness initiative in partnership with local businesses that honor and serve our veterans. And the first location we will support is this cafe, under the leadership of Grace Donnelly. The crowd outside erupted in cheers. Ray McMillan stood at the front, shadow by his side, tears streaming down his face. Grace's knees buckled. Someone caught her. She looked up and saw Colonel Gaines walking toward her, hand extended. Thank you, he said simply, for seeing us. Grace couldn't speak. She just nodded. And in that moment, everything she'd lost came flooding back. Not the job, not the cafe, but the belief that doing the right thing still mattered, that standing up for someone still meant something, that dignity, quiet and unshakable, was still worth defending. What do you do when the world suddenly knows your name? Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat in her living room, phone buzzing nonstop, emails pouring in, messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years. The video had exploded. Millions of views, thousands of comments, news segments, think pieces. Everyone wanted to talk about the woman who'd been fired for protecting a veteran. But Grace didn't want to be famous. She just wanted her life back. The next morning, Colonel Gaines called again. "Miss Donnelly, I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to hear me out. There's something bigger happening here." He explained the proposal. A federally supported veteran wellness center right there in Mason. Not just a cafe, but a full resource hub. Counseling, job placement, community support, and they wanted Grace to run it. "I'm not qualified for that," she said quietly. "You're the only one who is." Grace hesitated. She thought about Michael. About the veterans who'd sat in her cafe, broken and trying to find their way back. About Ray and Shadow and all the others who just needed a place to breathe. "Okay," she said, "I'll do it." The wellness center opened 6 months later in a renovated building 2 blocks from the old cafe. It was bigger, brighter, but it still felt like Grace. Warm, human, real. The walls were lined with photos of veterans, their stories written in their own words. There was a coffee bar in the corner, simple and familiar, with those same ceramic mugs Grace had saved for Hero's Hour. And every Wednesday at 9 in the morning, they still gathered. The circle had grown. More faces, more stories, more lives quietly stitching themselves back together. Ray became a regular volunteer, Shadow by his side, greeting every new veteran who walked through the door with the same calm presence that had saved Ray's life more times than he could count. Grace moved through the space like she always had, remembering names, asking questions, making sure no one sat alone. But she also had help now. Tiffany, a young female Marine who'd struggled with PTSD after her deployment, became Grace's assistant. She understood the weight of coming home to a world that didn't quite fit anymore. She knew what it meant to need a place like this. And Lena, a local teacher who'd lost her brother in Iraq, started bringing coffee every Friday. Not just coffee, but laughter. And when Grace needed a second opinion on anything, from paint colors to program ideas, Lena was the first to weigh in. But not everyone was thrilled. Some officials questioned why someone with no formal training was running a federal pilot program. Auditors arrived quietly, clipboards in hand, suits stiff with skepticism. They examined logs, asked probing questions, even tested the water filters on the coffee machine. At the end of their review, one inspector looked Grace dead in the eye and asked, "What certifications do you hold that qualify you to counsel veterans?" Grace didn't blink. "I don't have certifications," she said softly, "just consistency and kindness." The inspector didn't respond, but he took notes. A week later, Grace received a formal notice. The wellness center was being reviewed for possible national model expansion. Colonel Gaines called it a victory. Grace just called it humbling. But even as the center grew, the Mason mug still tugged at her heart. One afternoon, she returned quietly without announcement. Lena was behind the counter now, running the place with the same care Grace once had. "You're supposed to be famous now," Lena teased, sliding a mug across the counter. "I'm just here for coffee," Grace said, smiling. The cafe had changed. Photos of veterans now lined the walls. Ray, Tiffany, others. A new sign had been hung near the register. "Grace's Corner, where no one sits alone." Later that day, Grace drove across town to speak at a local fundraiser for veteran families. It was a modest event, mostly older folks and kids with crayon posters. She spoke without notes. "I didn't set out to build a program," she said. "I just refused to throw out a man and his dog." The crowd fell silent. Then applause, loud, long, real. And somewhere in the back, Ray stood, his silver star pinned to his chest, and gave her a quiet salute. Back at the center that night, Grace sat alone by the wall of photos. She added one more. A picture of the cafe taken the day after the Humvees came. People standing shoulder to shoulder. Dogs lying under tables, coffee in every hand. No fear, no shame, just connection. Above it, she taped a small card that read, "Legacy isn't what we build for ourselves. It's what we protect in others." And in that stillness, Grace understood. The cafe hadn't closed. It had simply moved. Why does validation always arrive in an envelope? 3 weeks after the fundraiser, a letter came. It arrived in a sealed envelope stamped with the gold emblem of the Department of Defense. Colonel Gaines handed it to Grace personally. They stood inside her office at the wellness center, surrounded by the quiet hum of a space still learning how to heal. He didn't say much. Just, "You'll want to sit for this." She opened it slowly. The official language blurred as her eyes scanned the first line. "You are hereby nominated for the National Civilian Commendation for Distinguished Service to Veterans." She read it again, then again. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. Colonel Gaines chuckled. "That's exactly why you're getting it." The letter came with an invitation, not just to attend a ceremony in Washington, but to speak at the National Veterans Advocacy Conference. Grace felt her knees go weak. "I'm not a public speaker. You are now." The day she left for D.C., she packed light. Just one blazer, an old watch of Michael's, and the same notebook she'd used behind the cafe counter for years. Names, birthdays, notes like "Tiffany prefers tea and don't ask Ray about May 15th. That notebook had carried more weight than any resume. As she waited at the airport, she heard someone call her name. "Need a ride, Miss Donnelly?" She turned to see Ray McMillan standing tall in full dress blues, shadow calm by his side, tail gently wagging. "The base assigned me as your escort," he said with a grin. Grace laughed, half nerves, half awe. "You clean up pretty good." He smirked. "You're the one about to speak to the Pentagon." The ballroom at the conference was larger than she expected. White tablecloths, polished brass podium, cameras at every angle. Her name glowed on the screen behind her in elegant lettering. When she stepped up to the microphone, her voice was smaller than the room, but the room leaned in. "I'm not a general," she said. "I'm not a doctor. I didn't write policy. I managed a cafe near a military base. I served coffee. I listened." A pause, but in that space I watched something sacred happen. Veterans came not for advice but for presence. They didn't need to be fixed. They needed to be seen. People nodded. A few wiped away tears. One day I got fired for letting a man sit with his service dog. That was the moment everything changed. But the truth is, it was never about coffee. It was about dignity. Applause thundered through the hall. Ray stood in the back. He didn't cheer. He didn't clap. He just nodded like a soldier hearing his orders finally clearly. Later that night, as the sun dipped behind the Potomac, Grace stepped outside alone. She needed air, space, silence. A man in a gray suit with a white beard approached. Quiet, kind eyes behind thin glasses. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked. She studied his face. It stirred something. He pulled out an old photograph. Grainy, faded, her, Michael, and this older man in uniform outside the cafe long before her husband's last deployment. "You poured me a cup of coffee the day I got my medical discharge," he said. "You didn't say anything, you just smiled. It was the first time I felt like myself again." He held out the photo. "It's yours now." She took it with trembling fingers, words caught in her throat. Back home in Mason, the town held a welcome celebration, but Grace didn't go straight there. She returned to the wellness center. It was late, quiet. A few veterans still lingered near the fire pit. She walked to the wall of photos, reached into her bag and added one more. A snapshot of the conference crowd giving her a standing ovation. Beside it, she taped the old cafe photo, the one with Michael and the soldier from long ago. And below them, she wrote a simple line: "Honor grows where kindness is consistent." As she turned to leave, a young veteran with nervous eyes stepped through the door. "Is this the place for, people like us?" Grace smiled gently. "No, son. This is the place for people like all of us." And just like that, her circle wasn't just full, it was open. In a world that moves faster every day, it's easy to overlook the quiet moments. The soft-spoken waitress, the trembling veteran, the wag of a service dog's tail. But sometimes those moments are the ones that shape us. Grace Donnelly didn't wear a uniform. She didn't hold rank, but she upheld something sacred: dignity. And in doing so, she reminded us all that honor isn't earned once, it's defended daily. What happened at that small cafe in Mason, Georgia, may seem like a rare story, but maybe it shouldn't be. How many graces have we walked past without noticing? How many veterans have we thanked only with words, not actions? Grace's story asks us to pause. To ask ourselves, would I have stood up like she did? Have I ever kept quiet when I should have spoken up? Because sometimes the strongest stand doesn't come with a salute. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.